Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm so grateful to be here with you today. Grateful to the administrators, the staff, the students who put this program together, and grateful to the spirits of our ancestors, the Orishas, the Inkisis, the great mothers and fathers of the universe who have brought us all here together so that we can spend some time thinking and talking and being together, discussing another meaning of the world, wisdom or lessons from Afro-Atlantic religions for traumatic times. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, good. My hope today is to share a few insights with you related to the wisdoms and traditions of the Afro-Atlantic religions that I study and teach. I grew up in a household in Atlanta, Georgia, where the mystic and activist orientations of Black religion in the United States were our family grounding. And these understandings helped me find my way as a young adult to the Candomblé communities of Bahia, Brazil, where I felt very much at home. Perhaps the single most striking and salient shared element of religions like Haitian Vodou, Regla de Ocha, also known as Santeria or Lucumí, Brazilian Candomblé, and the mysticism of African American Christianity is that these ways of being in the world enabled Africans and their descendants to cultivate and maintain a profound sense of humanity in the midst of extraordinary ongoing traumas. At their best, Afro-Atlantic religions, I suggest, represent in their practice, their cosmologies, and their lessons another meaning of the human, another model of the possible, another mode of access to guidance and strength, another meaning of the world in which we live. In every country of the Americas and the Caribbean, there is an African presence. From Canada in the north to Argentina and Chile in the south, and everywhere in between. In recent decades, significant numbers of Africans have immigrated to the hemisphere voluntarily, in particular to North America. Still, the vast majority of Black people in the Western Hemisphere are descendants of the approximately 15 million West, Central, Southern, and East African peoples who were forcibly transported in the Middle Passage and enslaved in the colonies and nations of the Americas between the 16th and 19th centuries. All of these people were members of indigenous African communities who possessed tremendously rich and varied philosophical, cosmological, scientific, artistic, and ritual understandings about the world that oriented their lives. While some of the captive people were Muslim, and a few had been practicing Christianity before arriving in the Americas in the holds of slave ships, most of the African men, women, and children enslaved in the New World were raised with indigenous ancestral traditions and understandings developed over many millennia of human wisdom and interaction with the natural world and the realm of the spirit. And they held on to as much of that wisdom as they could. Wherever Black people found themselves, whether in countries with Protestants or Catholics as the hegemonic class, they used a combination of African indigenous traditions, often merged with Native American rites and understandings, and sometimes refashioned Christian practices and precepts as well, thus formulating new religious meanings in the New World. Whether we consider the liberationist Christianity developed in the slave quarters and hush harbors of US plantations, or the Haitian, Cuban, and Brazilian ceremonies in honor of Orishas, the Inkisis, the Loa, the Vodouns, all of these names for African ancestral energies and the natural forces of the universe, wind, earth, fire, water, etc. In almost all cases, the religions Black people developed in the Americas were religions that sharply and continually contested the imposed identity of slave and cultivated, even celebrated, a much deeper, broader, and fully human identity of Black folks as sons and daughters of the sacred. There are dozens of African-based religions in the Americas. Among the major representatives of this broad tradition are Regla Ocha and Palo Mayombe, both with roots in Cuba, Vodou from Haiti, Winti from Suriname, Maria Leonza in Venezuela, Obia and Rastafarianism in Jamaica, the Spiritual Baptists in Trinidad and Tobago, Candomblé, Umbanda, and Casa de Minas, and the Egun tradition in Brazil, and the Southern mystic practices of African American Christianity in the USA. Historian of religion Charles Long offers some helpful thinking about what religion is and means in a diasporic sense for Black individuals and communities in the Americas. Long defines religion as orientation in the ultimate sense. That is, how one comes to terms with the ultimate significance of one's place in the world. For people of African descent, both during slavery and in its aftermath, religion thus becomes the means by which we remember and cultivate an alternative understanding of ourselves. Hello, Shirley, so glad to see you here. In the face of generational assaults and centuries of denial by the structures of white supremacy and temporal power. For Black people, from a Longian perspective, religion is how you remember who you really are, in spite of what the outside society might say about you. In many ways, the religions we are discussing today can be understood as religions of resistance to and negotiation of the traumas that laid the political, economic, and racial foundations of modernity. African diaspora religions are also, in many instances, rituals of personal and collective poetic imagination, healing, and reconnection to ancestral strengths. In this way, they are precursors to the Afro-futurist movements of the late 20th and early 21st century. They are religions whose emphasis is on cultivating and sustaining a meaning of human life and human community, a meaning of Blackness beyond the limitations imposed by the status quo of slavery, genocidal violence, white supremacy, and the accompanying structural inequalities. As we think about the African religiosity and cosmology that widely and deeply informed and shaped the religions of the diaspora in the Atlantic world, there are at least 4 initial foundational concepts I would urge us to consider. These are radical interdependence, an expansive notion of human community, reciprocity and balance, and the centrality of music and movement. And I'll say something briefly about each of those. First, the acknowledgement of interdependence among human beings, the natural world, and the world of the spirit. This is a holistic orientation that recognizes that the universe is filled with life force, known by many names in different languages, but essentially the same concept. It's called Ashe in Yoruba, or Ngunzu in Kimbundu, and there is a word for this concept in almost all of the African languages, indigenous languages of the continent. It is an understanding that everything and everybody that exists is a carrier, a vessel of the life force. This orientation includes the principle that all the created world is, in a sense, a manifestation of the Creator. And the divine, the energy of the sacred, can be accessed in the myriad forms of the natural world, in rivers, in earth, in wind, in plants and trees, in animals, in stones, in storms, in all the formations of nature. As Candomblé elder Makota Balgina Pinto used to say, humans are nature, and all of nature is connected. And all forms of nature are ways to engage with spirit. This integrated understanding of being is a basic shared philosophical or cosmological precept in African traditional religions, and it is an important foundational concept in Afro-Atlantic religions as well. 2, the human community includes ancestors, the living, and the unborn. This is a philosophical perspective similar to the Haudenosaunee tradition of the law of 7 generations, or the Southern African principle of Ubuntu. It is an orientation common among North and South American Native peoples, as well as Asian Pacific Islanders and indigenous European folks like the Sami and the Roma. It is the idea that as human beings, we are connected to and responsible for more than just our own individual physical selves. It is a principle that values generosity and openness to others, that puts restraints on unchecked greed and individualism. A tradition of making room and welcome, recognizing that we are more than just the physical body we show up in the world with. We are never in this world by ourselves, and neither our destinies nor our strengths and challenges are separate. 3, reciprocity and balance. Again, as in many indigenous traditions around the world, in African traditional religions, a key principle is the maintenance of the balance of giving and receiving, of the kind of equilibrium that promotes health and well-being for people as well as in social, political, and economic institutions. And of course, in the engagement of human beings with the rest of the natural world and the world of spirit. It's a concept concerned with the maintenance of what Christians might call right relationship, a meaning of justice and sharing in relationships, a value of compassion as well as discernment. Again, a recognition of independence among all life. Here, reciprocity and balance is not only operative among humans, but with natural forces, animals, plants, and spirits as well. 4, the importance of music and movement in worship. Throughout the African continent and into the diaspora, music, especially as we heard today, percussive sound and movement, in particular sacred dance, are essential elements of invoking and engaging with divinity. Scholar Jacob Olupona writes that in some African creation stories, humans emerge into the world from sound. The Bambara of Mali teach that the cosmos began with a single sound, before which there was only a vast void. And the sacred sound at the center of the cosmos created all the planets and stars, as well as all sentient and non-sentient beings on Earth. Among the West African peoples who cultivate pantheons representing the natural forces of the universe, each deity has specific dances, specific songs, specific rhythms that are used to praise, call, and represent that energy in communion with human beings. Sound and movement are central to the way people of African descent cultivate our relationship with the sacred. In the Christianity that developed in the slave quarters and in the brush harbors, as well as in other forms of Black religion that emerged in the Caribbean and in Central and South America, the combination of singing, music, and dance, often with percussion instruments or percussive beats. For example, when African Americans were in a situation in many parts of the country where drums were outlawed, people began to use their feet and broom handles and clapping hands, whatever they could use from their bodies to make the percussive sounds that are what call the spirit into our space. All of these were indispensable means of prayer, vital forms of communicating with the divine, whether in the sacred circle dances of Candomblé, the collective dance of Afro-Cuban and Cuban-American bembes, the danced rites and the mounfours of Vodou, or the ring shouts of the United States. All of these forms represent ways in which Africans in the Americas remembered a dismembered community into a new kind of wholeness. So these four concepts of African religiosity are where we are beginning our examination of Africana religions on this side of the Atlantic. Radical interdependence, an expansive notion of human community, reciprocity and balance, and the centrality of music and movement. In addition to these foundational elements, I want to offer a few stories that help demonstrate the deep connection of African American Christianity to other Afro-Atlantic traditions, and that also suggest some of the additional wisdoms these practices can offer to us for our lives today. This year, I will be an initiated member of the Terreiro do Cobre Candomblé community in Salvador, Bahia for 22 years. Although I often feel like there is so much that I don't know about Candomblé, it is my experience, practice, and apprenticeship in the Afro-Brazilian ritual tradition that has enabled me to see and appreciate the profound gifts and lessons of the African American mystic tradition that I inherited from my mother and father. I'll talk about three of those conceptual gifts and wisdoms: the idea of ancestralidade and accompaniment, examples of mystic attention and healing, and finally, women's leadership and radical mothering. And that should be plenty for one morning. Hopefully, we'll still have some time for questions and conversation together at the close of the lecture. Ancestralidade and accompaniment. I was first introduced to this term, ancestralidade, by my teacher, Valgina Pinto, who passed in March of last year. Makota Valgina, as she was known, was a brilliant spokesperson on behalf of Afro-Brazilian religions and an indefatigable activist for environmental justice and the human rights of Black people in Brazil and the diaspora. As you will see this afternoon in Donna Roberts' beautiful film, Iemanjá, Makota Valgina says that in traditional African religion and in Candomblé, an ethic of environmental justice understands the well-being of people, all people, as central to the health of the planet. There is no separation between the environment and all the forms of life who share this earth together. Makota Valgina beautifully describes the understanding that all the other forms of life that preceded human beings on earth and that enable human human continuity, plants, water, earth, air, animals, fire, minerals, all of these elements of the natural world are ancestors of human beings. The word ancestralidade is a Portuguese term translated literally into English as ancestrality. It's a way of talking about the importance of ancestors, ancestral connection, and ancestral inheritances in Afro-Brazilian religion. Honoring elders and ancestors is a foundational concept in all Afro-Atlantic religions. Spiritual gifts are believed to be passed on through the ancestral line, as if encoded in the DNA. This is true of spiritual responsibilities, too. In Candomblé, for example, your responsibility as a devotee is not only to your blood family and spiritual family, but to the ongoing work of balancing, healing, blessing, strengthening the ashe, the life force of your community and of the world. feeding the spirits that accompany and bless us. There are related concepts of ancestral connection in the African American Southern mystic tradition. One example comes to us from Episcopalian lay leader, public theologian, and longtime activist Ruby Sales, whose story demonstrates the power of sacred songs of Black Christian tradition as connections to ancestral strength. In 1963, in Hayneville, Alabama, Ruby, while a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, witnessed the murder of her friend and movement co-worker, Jonathan Daniels, when their small group of protesters was attacked by the white owner of a gas station as they entered to purchase sodas. In the months that followed, Ruby received threats that she too would be killed if she testified against the murderer. For a while, she was in such apprehension that she became mute. She was about 16 at the time. In an interview in 1998, Ruby explained that she was able to conquer her fear of testifying by singing the sacred music that had been created by her enslaved ancestors and taught to her by her grandmother, the spirituals. Songs like, "How did you feel when you come out the wilderness?" and "We've come this far by faith." Ruby said that even before this particular tragedy, when she was learning the songs at her grandmother's side, she experienced the eliding minor tones of the music as links to the suffering and the strength of people who had come before her. And in her own distress, the young activist instinctively called up the music that she associated with the moral and spiritual courage of her community. Ruby says that when she sang the songs, she felt her ancestors rising in her voice, and ultimately, she was able to get up on the courtroom stand and tell her story. This use of Black sacred song to give courage and the ancestral connection Sales inferred from the singing links an African American mystic sensibility to the idea of ancestralidade and the possibility of accessing generational strength for people of African descent and for others struggling for justice wherever we are in the world. Ruby Sales' impulsion to action via the voices of her ancestors is echoed in another story from our Candomblé elder, Valgina Pinto. In addition to her work as an activist, Makota Valgina was a beloved ritual leader in the Angola tradition of Candomblé, responsible for training new initiates, caring for and assisting the incorporated inquisis, or sacred energies, and generally offering guidance and wisdom to the religious community as a whole. She was one of the best known and most widely respected educators and activists in Bahia, and her organizing work was firmly grounded in her experience as a devotee of Candomblé. In her memoir, Meu Caminhar, Meu Viver, Makota Valgina writes about an experience she had in the early 1970s at a mukondo, a Candomblé funeral ceremony. She was a primary school teacher and a catechist in the Catholic Church at the time, not initiated in Candomblé. But due to her growing awareness of racial justice issues, she was beginning to question the demonization of Afro-Brazilian religions by Christianity. That's a whole other lecture. At the funeral rite, she watched from outside the circle of participants, and she recalled that it was an odd and uncomfortable feeling for her, standing as a mere witness to this striking moment of remembrance of the African origins of the person who had recently passed. In the funeral rites of Candomblé, regardless of the ritual lineage, the nation that the person who was being honored came from, and in the context of Bahia, there are 3 or 4 major lineages: the Yoruba, the Dahomian or Jeje, the Congo, Angola, and then the indigenous from Brazil called the Caboclo Nation. But regardless of which of those, or there are a number of kind of sub-nations as well, in the funeral ceremony, songs of all African nations that can be remembered by anybody present are sung, as if to call in the collective ancestors and to join the person who has passed with that vast community of folks who experienced the Middle Passage and who helped create the meaning of Black community in the New World. So this is what she was witnessing. Valgina remembers hearing her grandmother and great-grandmother's voices, not so much as a distinct sound in her ear, more like a sensation of knowing, still with great clarity and directness. Her ancestors were asking her why she was standing on the outside, telling her that she needed to be a part of the ceremonial circle. Valgina says, quote, "It was as if I was surrounded by all of my relatives who had passed on, even those I hadn't known, and even those who were not Candomblé devotees. I think that's the best way to explain what happened to me in that ritual, the ritual which I think is the most profound in Candomblé," unquote. This event marked the activist in a very significant way, and it was at that moment, as she frequently explained, that she determined to leave the Catholic Church and to work for the respect and dignity of her people from within the tradition of Candomblé. One final example of the concept of ancestralidade, or ancestral connection and mutual relationship, comes from my mother and father, and is a strategy they used in their teaching, as well as in their work as historians and activists. It's grounded in this meaning of accompaniment that permeates so many aspects of the Black religious experience in the Americas. The certainty and the rituals of remembering that we are never alone in our struggles, that our ancestors' wisdom and strength is available to us. Starting sometime in the early 1980s, if my memory serves me correctly, my parents began to add a particular ritual of introduction to the classes they taught together at the Iliff School of Theology and the workshops and retreats they led for various activist groups around the country. They would ask each person in the room, as part of presenting themselves to the group, to call the name of their maternal grandmother, their mama's mama, and share a bit of information about her with the gathered community. In her memoir, Remnants, my mom explains, quote, "We know that grandmothers have traditionally played a pivotal role in the formation of cultural and moral identity among many peoples. And so we began asking folks in the workshops to talk about their grandmothers, or if they didn't know their grandmothers, to talk about an older relative who was important to them. This was a way to begin to acknowledge the importance of ancestors," unquote. Mama and Daddy were both historians, and they each developed powerful relationships with the historical figures they studied and taught. For Daddy, his predecessors in the work of writing and teaching the history of African American struggle were like spiritual fathers and older brothers to him. W.B. Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, Martin Luther King Jr., and others. In fact, I remember hearing my daddy tell the story on a few occasions of how, as he labored to finish his major work on the Black struggle for freedom in the U.S., There Is a River, he was very worried about how the gatekeepers of the academy would receive it. Because he wrote the book with a decidedly personal tone, inserting himself clearly in the lineage of resistance and not feigning an objective perspective. We were already living a very itinerant life because my dad's activism and the nature of his scholarship made him, shall we say, a complicated choice for most traditional colleges and universities at the time. Daddy said that one day, not long before he finished the manuscript, he had a dream of standing in an empty church, perhaps the one in which he grew up in New York City, Victory Tabernacle. In the dream, He was standing inside near the altar, anxious and worried, when he turned around and saw in the balcony the elder historians and activists who he so admired. And to a man, they looked down at my daddy and nodded and gently smiled and told him to go ahead and write in the way he wanted, that he had their support. Which brings us now to mystic attention and healing. Theologian Barbara Holmes has written about traditions of Southern African American mystic spirituality and their relationship to healing. In her essay, Wonder Working Power, she reflects that many Black folks have been reluctant to fully embrace the ritual practices of healing, discernment or second sight, and communication with ancestors that are often part of our family legacies. Instead, she writes, quote, "Those of us who inherited these aptitudes have chosen to sublimate them into traditional religious beliefs. We join churches and try to fit the gifts of foresight and dream knowledge into the ordinary experiences of congregational life. Only with others of our kind do we whisper about the visitations and messages from the other side." Now in my 50s, with both my parents and all my aunts and uncles and grandparents and many older cousins on the other side of the river, I recognize how privileged I was to grow up in a household and family where those mystic traditions that Holmes talks about were daily resources we used to make our way in the world. My mother taught us to pay attention to and interpret our dreams, to use music and dance to transform the energy of the house and our own personal energies, to listen to the signs in the natural world around us, to know the presence of the holy when it's settled into our bodies, and to use the healing power of our hands and in our prayers to help people who needed care. When I found my way to Candomblé, I felt very much at home because the kitchen-centered, women-led, inclusive mystic space of family-making and deep healing work was just another version of what I knew from my own family, especially my mother. One of the most striking examples of using mystic attention for guidance and encouragement comes from the experience of Harriet Tubman, perhaps the best known of the conductors of the Underground Railroad, that network of women and men who risked their lives to help enslaved people make their way to freedom in the 19th century. I haven't seen the new film about Harriet Tubman, so you all, if you have seen it, will have to tell me if what I'm describing is depicted there. Harriet is recognized as having led more than 300 enslaved people in multiple runs through the forests, swamps, and back roads of the southern U.S. and north to freedom. She also served during the Civil War as a spy, a scout, and a leader of the raid on Combahee Ferry in South Carolina, where Union forces liberated 700 more African Americans. In telling her story to writer Sarah Bradford, Harriet said very little, if anything, about her relationship to formal structures of church during her childhood. But she was very conscious of what she described as a family legacy of spiritual gifts that included her father's ability to foretell the future and her own capacity to access unmediated divine guidance for the well-being of her passengers on the Underground Railroad, and for her own strength and perception as she navigated woods and rivers, towns and backcountry byways, leading people away from slavery. Tubman had received a head injury as a child, and she was said to have suffered from frequent fits of somnolence or sleeping spells as a result for the rest of her life. Often, her uncanny foresight and discernment came to Harriet in the midst of the spells. At other times, they came via dreams, in sleep, in waking visions, and in what she described as miraculous answers to prayer. Biographer Jean Humez writes that there are many stories of Harriet Tubman avoiding capture while she was rescuing enslaved people, which Tubman attributed to God answering her prayers. Humes writes, quote, God was Tubman's name for the source of visionary guidance for her anti-slavery action. Prayer enabled her to tap directly into the source of such guidance, unquote. For Harriet, the successes of her activism on behalf of her people, her bravery in the face of overarching odds, are to be understood in terms of her intimate communications with spirit and the miracles that came as a result of prayer. The final section of my talk today explores the concepts of women's ritual leadership and radical mothering, particularly as embodied in Bahian Candomblé and in my mother's life and experience. In many of the oldest and most traditional tejedos, the Candomblé temple communities, women are the supreme ritual leaders, Iyalorishas, who direct the ceremonial cultivation of divinized forces of nature, the Orishas, the Inquisis, the Vodou's. Ethnologist Maria José Lopes da Silva explains that Candomblé is a particularly strong example of the process in the diaspora where Black women were often in the position of recreating meanings and linkages of family relations that had been violently shattered by the Middle Passage and slavery. In Candomblé, African women and their female children, grandchildren, and initiates became essentially clan leaders, lineage leaders, responsible for the reformulation of African collectivities in the New World context, as well as for the perpetuation of vital ancestral and spiritual relationships that aided the healing and stability of individuals and communities living under great hardship. Under the leadership of women, Candomblé tejedos have become spaces widely noted for remarkable inclusivity and for the integration of people of all ages, gender expressions, and social classes. Candomblé offers, in Lopes da Silva's words, quote, a great example of an innovative alternative structure within a wider patriarchal society. Within the tejedo structure, women have a power, a visibility, a defining role that exists without negating the masculine principle. There is a relationship of partnership between women and men. And within the tejedo, the Iyalorisha, the supreme female leader, the spiritual mother, surrounds herself with a community of people where everyone has a role. The children, the elders, the new initiates, the men. In this structure, no one is left out. No one is overlooked. No one is unnecessary. It's a structure with room for everybody, where everyone is fully integrated into the life of the community. This character of Candomblé was and continues to be one of the great attractions of the religion for me. It is a privileged space of women's religious leadership, especially Black women's leadership. I'll close today with a reading from Remnants, which is my mother's spiritual autobiography that she and I wrote together, that speaks in a particular way to women's mystic attention and the lessons and power of women's ritual leadership. Do I have about 10 more minutes to share? Okay. So the piece that I'm going to share with you is comes from a section of the book on the Pachamamas. And you may be familiar with this term. It's a Quechua word that means the earth mothers. And before I read this, I just need to say that my mother was sick for about 7 years before she passed with strange complications of adult onset diabetes. And when she first began to be sick, or to get very sick, I was just finishing my PhD. This is back in about 96, 97. And I didn't realize how ill she was. And we were in a store one day, and I said something kind of sharp to her. And immediately, you know how you say something and then as soon as it comes out of your mouth, you're like, yeah. And I looked at my mother and she looked like I had hit her, you know, it hurt her that much. And it was either that night or the next night, I had this dream. And in the dream, there were these 4 or 5 tall women. And they were each a different race or different color. There was Asian looking one who looked like she was indigenous to Africa. There was one who looked like she was from Europe. There was one who looked like maybe Native American and maybe from the Pacific Islands. But they were all standing together. They had these long robes. They were very tall. And my mother was standing behind them. And you know how in a dream, you just kind of understand without actually hearing the words coming out of people's mouths. And these women were telling me, I remember the phrase, even though I did, as I said, I'm just hearing it in my spirit, but they said to me, "What do you know of mothering?" And it was as if they were trying to say, if you can't take care of this woman who is very special to us, that's not going to be good for you. And it frightened me so powerfully that it took me a year before I could even say anything to my mother about it. But when I eventually told her this story, she just took this idea of the Pachamamas, because one of the things that I came to understand from them was that even though they were all different races, they were charged with taking care of each other's children all over the world. These were the mothers of the world, the mothers of all of us. Powerful, powerful female energies. And they wanted me to know that I needed to get on the ball and take care of my mom. So that's the preface. And then let me just read this section now. This is in my mother's voice. And she talks about Sue Bailey Thurman. I don't know how many of you are old enough or who have been in this area enough to know or have known Howard Thurman and his wonderful second wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, and the Church of the Fellowship of All Peoples. But Mrs. Thurman and Howard were like surrogate parents in a way to my parents, and they had a very close relationship with both of them. So this piece begins with my mother's reflection on Mrs. Thurman. It starts with an epigraph. Well, it's called The Pachamama Circle 2, Sue Bailey Thurman and the Harriets. And it starts with an epigraph. The quiet ways we develop to protect ourselves, each other, in slavery. The glance, the sent word, the straying, safety construed of open lacework silence, a circle of energy, a circle of protection in the world. In her later years, I would visit Mrs. Sue Bailey Thurman at the townhouse in San Francisco where she and her husband had lived together. We were old friends, and after Howard Thurman passed on, Vincent and I felt a special concern for Mrs. Thurman. We saw her as often as we could. I always loved those visits with that gentle, brilliant, elegant woman. She had traveled the world and was knowledgeable about many things. She was a writer, a civic organizer, a profound thinker, and like her husband, she had a deep, abiding interest in mysticism, justice, and peace. Once, as I was arriving, walking up the hill to her house, I had the sense of something unsafe. You know how you can get a feeling of something not quite right? I felt that. I was nearing the house, so I kept walking toward it, but with my awareness keen to the circumstances around me. By the time I reached my destination, Mrs. Thurman was downstairs waiting for me. Now, normally she didn't meet me downstairs. Normally she'd wait for me to ring the bell, and then she would buzz me in, and I'd climb the stairs to the main entrance of the house. But this time, she was downstairs in the foyer, and she was opening the door for me. And I could feel she had been sending protection out to me, just like I had felt my own mother, Mama Freeney, do years ago as I came up to the door of the house at 41st and Whitworth in Chicago. I didn't know exactly what it was I was perceiving as I approached Mrs. Thurman's place, just something not right, a possible danger to me. Anyway, I felt it, and then I felt protected. When we got upstairs to her living room, we were silent. She and I sat, and the two of us went quiet inside ourselves. That's what we would do when we needed to sense the presence of this circle. This circle I'm telling you about. Howard Thurman has a story about this kind of care and danger. I heard him tell it a few times, and a version is printed in his book, The Luminous Darkness. In the story, Thurman is traveling by railroad and arrives at a small southern town late at night where he is met by a black man he doesn't know with a message to be cautious. Thurman has disembarked to wait for a connecting train, and the man approaches him unannounced and begins walking alongside him, explaining that there's tension in the area because the sheriff was killed that afternoon and it isn't safe for a black man to go into town. He advises Thurman to sit in the segregated waiting room with his suitcase in full view in front of him so that any white man approaching will see that he's a stranger waiting for a connecting coach, and he will be less likely to be harmed. The man doesn't talk long. He has met every train that has arrived during the night and given the warning to black passengers as they got off. Thurman told this story from his own experience, but he also told it as an example of what was typical among black people in that time. It was indicative of the way, if there was danger, somebody would be sent to warn you, to protect you. Living in the 1920s and 30s, especially in the South, required a certain sensitivity and attunement to jeopardy and an understanding of one's connectedness as a black person to others who shared your vulnerability. That awareness was put at the service of individuals and families, as well as the larger community. The concern was not solely for racist violence, although there was that. It was also generally a concern for protection of people who might be in danger. It was something that black people had to be constantly aware of, and so I think we developed a certain discernment about it. I think women had a heightened sense of this, and they would send people to look out for those who might be at risk. This was the kind of perceptiveness Mrs. Thurman carried. My mother had it too. I remember Mama Freeney used to just send us places. Go there, go see about Miss So-and-so, go here. And we didn't ask why, we just went. She would tell us to go check on neighbors or younger nieces and nephews. My niece Jean remembers how Mama Freeney dreamed ways to help people in situations, to know when and what to do. My mother would talk about who she had seen in a dream, people dead and gone, and what they told her should be done. There's a story I've been thinking of that I want to tell about this. There's a group of women. They're women, and they're also spirits. They live all over the world, among all the world's people, and they're connected to each other. But their connection is secret. The women are all African because we are all African. They are the daughters of the first mother. The women carry a knowledge and tradition of protection, a wisdom of transformation. It is not a spoken knowledge. It is not something anyone talks about. It's in the body, glimpsed from an angle when they are slicing onions or braiding hair or setting the limbs of a poem. Mostly you can see it when they dance or when they are sitting utterly still. It is a gene, an element of their cells that rests in the mitochondria. It vitalizes their bloodline. These women are vessels and founts. They are a source, the ones who remember what it is to be human in the world. They preserve this wisdom in the art of their lives, cultivating it in stories, in the way they move, in in the paintings and pots they sculpt, in the fearlessness of their fighting. They carry this knowledge in their bodies as they go about their tasks and the encounters of their days, and they pass it on quietly. Their children, all of their children, have a bit of the inheritance. It is like a seed, but it won't bloom until they too are older, and it is the female line that passes the wisdom on. These women are of every race and every shade of skin and texture and color of hair. Their bodies are of every size, but all of their spirits are tall. They are physical and they are ethereal. These are the Pachamamas, the protective spirits of the earth, so named by the people of the Andes Mountains in the Quechua language. They are the most ancient spirit mothers, sisters to Nana, Buruku, and Amaterasu. They are all connected. Wherever they are, they recognize each other. You know, my mother told me there were many Harriet Tubmans. She told me whispering, as if it was something still to be shrouded, still to be protected, this fact, this sisterhood, so that they could rise again to help us when we need them. My great-grandmother, Grandma Rice, said she had met Harriet, said she knew of other women too who stole into the swamps, into the night perils with 1, 2, 3, 7 people behind them following their leading out of slavery. In my story, these women are all Pachamamas. They're part of that circle of protection, that circle of grace that has been here since the beginning of the world, since the beginning of people. They have promised to take care of each other's children all over the world. So you cannot tell who will love you by race, who will shelter you just by nation. They are all our mothers, and we are all their children. In slavery time, some of these women look white. The caramel tan of their faces, muscled forearms, and exposed feet contrasted with the stark cream color of their legs, of their backs, when the masters lifted their clothes to beat them. These women, all colors, helped each other. The ones who worked in the big house, sending messages to others in the field. Tell Minty to go tonight. They're going to sell her and her children tomorrow. Canals from muck, chopping wood and making bricks alongside the men, found a meeting ground in a hush harbor someplace, steady patting feet in the backs of their babies, moaning in a presence that shored up their hearts for more struggle, more strength. And these women in slavery time, who had been through so much, whipped until they bled, their hands scarred, their faces and breasts scarred, because these were the most beautiful parts of their bodies. These women found their way into the Pachamama circle. In slavery time, the Pachamamas were Harriets, and later they were our Idas and Bessies, and they became Sue Bailey Thurman, and Elizabeth Catlett Mora, and Catherine Dunham, and Nina, and Billy, and Shirley Graham Du Bois, and Ella Baker, and Septa McClark, and my mama, and grandmama, and great-grandmama. They are Cleo Parker Robinson now, and Ann Braden, and Dolores Huerta, and Rachel Noel, and Marion King Jackson. We have so many women who stand mid-current in the river, giving fresh water to the tribes, showing us how to be well again. They are the warrior reconcilers, the healer sorcerers. They are the scientists, conjurers, the guides. And they are mothering. They are mothering, Rachel, drawing their circles of protection and power around us even as we look elsewhere. Teaching about how to be family, how to live like family, how to live with some strength and care in your hands, how to live with some joy in your mouth, how to put your hands gentle on where the wound is and draw out the grief, how to urge some kind of mercy into the shock-stained earth so that good will grow. These Pachamamas, let me tell you something about them. Let me tell you something about the way they mother. They stand sometimes a little bit on that side of uncertainty, just across the edge of where you don't always know what they might do, what they are capable of. I think about Iyemanja, the Orisha of salt waters, the sea mother. She is quintessential abundance and maternal energy, affectionate, generous with her love and her resources, feeding the world from the affluent waters of her womb. But the ocean is a mighty woman, Rachel. Iyemanja, when necessary, or as the moment strikes her, can discipline with a swiftness, insistent and devastating, even wrathful, imposing her strictures with fierceness and force, belying the steady, regular rhythm of her day-to-day waves. So there is this about the Pachamamas too. The great surge, the mountain, the whirlwind that rises quickly from the solar plexus and rushes wherever it must go, lifting grounded things high into air. And this is the circle I'm telling you about. All this is the circle. There are a lot of things, Rachel, that the family doesn't talk about. Mystic things that occupied Grandma Rye in her herbs, her medicines, her silences. If you listen to the older cousins, to my sisters, without asking them directly, you'll hear some of the things that Pamp says about how people were afraid of my mother, Mama Freeney. Well, that's where Mama Freeney got it from Grandma Rye. Also, the very quick way that Alma always says our great-grandmother was Christian, as if to head off any possibilities to the contrary. Some of these things are secret, and some of them will never be spoken, not from rule or restriction, but because they don't live in the language. They live in the body.
Yes.
They live in the gesture and the way the rays of the sun radiate off the Pachamama's backs, from their shoulders, their heads, their hands. Some of this is not something you talk about. It is in the body, like the Holy Ghost. It is in bone, in blood, in the soft space under the tongue, resting.